house was too quiet the night I finally understood what had been happening under my own roof. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years building a logistics company from a single leased truck in a phone book. I know how to read a contract, how to spot a bad deal before it turns into a lawsuit, how to tell when someone's lying to me across a conference table. I thought those skills transferred to home. I thought I'd know if something was wrong with the people I loved most. I was wrong about that, and it almost cost me everything. My wife and I had been married for 38 years. We met in our mid-20s at a hardware store. She was buying paint for her apartment. I was buying absolutely nothing because I'd followed her in from the parking lot and needed an excuse to be there. She caught me holding a pack of sandpaper I clearly had no use for and laughed. That laugh. Even now when I close my eyes, I can hear it exactly. We were married 14 months later. We had one son together. He was a good kid who grew into a complicated man. He moved to Portland after college, married a woman I'll call my daughter-in-law, and the two of them had a life that looked fine from the outside. Holidays, birthdays, the occasional Sunday call. My son called more than she did. That should have meant something to me. I filed it away under personality differences and moved on. My wife was diagnosed with a degenerative nerve condition 3 years ago. Not fatal, the doctors said. Manageable. But it meant she needed more help than I could provide alone while still running the company. We talked about options. She didn't want a stranger in the house. She said she'd feel like a patient. So when my daughter-in-law volunteered to come stay with us and help manage her care while my son remained in Portland for work, she was between jobs, she said, and wanted to help. My wife actually cried with relief. I want to be honest about this. I was relieved too. I was grateful. I told her that. I hugged her in the driveway when she arrived with 2 suitcases and a casserole dish, and I thought maybe I misjudged her all these years. Maybe this is who she really is. That was 18 months ago. The first few weeks were genuinely good. She cooked. She drove my wife to appointments. She organized the medication schedule into a binder with color-coded tabs. My wife seemed happy to have company during the days I was at the office. She started sleeping more, but the neurologist said that was consistent with her condition progressing. Nothing alarming. Everything had an explanation. It was my business partner who first said something to me. We'd known each other for 22 years. He's one of those men who has never once in his life softened a sentence to spare someone's feelings, which is occasionally infuriating and occasionally the most valuable quality a person can have. We're eating lunch at the diner we'd been eating lunch at since before either of us could afford to eat anywhere better, and he looked at me and said, "She looks worse every time I see her." "Your wife. She looks worse." I told him the condition was progressive. He nodded slowly, the way he nods when he doesn't believe you, but has decided not to fight about it yet. I drove home that evening thinking about it. I walked in, my daughter-in-law was in the kitchen, and my wife was already in bed at 6:15 in the evening. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom and watched her sleep. The lines in her face looked deeper than they had a month ago. Her hands on top of the blanket were thin in a way that troubled me. I went back to the kitchen. My daughter-in-law was stirring something on the stove and she smiled at me, and I smiled back, and I asked how the day had been, and she said fine, quiet, the usual. She said my wife had a good appetite at lunch, that she'd seemed cheerful. I looked at the pot she was stirring. "What's this?" I asked. "Just a broth," she said. "She's been having trouble with heavier foods." I nodded. I went upstairs and sat in the armchair in our room and watched my wife sleep. And I thought about the fact that 3 months ago, she'd eaten a full plate of pot roast at Sunday dinner and complained it needed more pepper. I thought about the color tabs in the medication binder. I thought about my business partner's face at the diner. And then I thought, you're a 62-year-old man who is tired and frightened for his wife and looking for something to be angry at because fear is harder to hold than suspicion. That's all this is. You're looking for a villain because you can't stand the idea of a disease. I went to bed and didn't say anything. But something had shifted. Something small and cold had moved into a room in the back of my mind and started unpacking. Over the next few weeks, I started paying attention differently, not to big things. There were no big things, to small things. I noticed my daughter-in-law was always present when the home health aide came by, always in the room, always nearby. I thought at first she was being attentive. Then I started watching where she positioned herself, and I realized she was always between the aide and my wife. Not in a dramatic way, just there. I noticed that whenever I called from the office to speak to my wife, there was a pause before the phone was handed over. 2, 3 seconds of muffled sound. Nothing. Just a pause. I noticed my wife had stopped asking me things. Small requests she used to make. Would I bring her the good cardigan from the hall closet? Would I see if there was any of that lemon tea left? Had stopped. At first I thought she was too tired. Then I thought maybe she was trying not to burden me. Then I thought about that pause on the phone. One evening, I came home early and found my daughter-in-law at my wife's bedside. My wife was asleep. My daughter-in-law had her back to the door and didn't hear me come in. She was sitting in the chair beside the bed, my chair where I sat every evening, and she was on her phone texting. When I said her name, she startled badly enough to drop it. She laughed it off. I laughed it off. But I saw, for just a half second before she laughed, the expression on her face when she turned around. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't embarrassment. It was calculation. A split-second assessment of what I'd seen and what I hadn't. I recognized it. I'd seen it across negotiating tables for 3 decades. That face doesn't belong in a sick room. That night I called my son. He was tired, distracted, apologetic about not having visited in 2 months. He said she was doing a great job, wasn't she? Really stepping up. I said, yes, she really was. I said I was proud of both of them for making this sacrifice. He sounded relieved that I'd said it. After I hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time. The next morning, I called a security company. I told them I wanted 2 cameras installed in the house. One in the hallway outside the bedroom, one aimed at the kitchen counter where the medications were kept. I told them it was for general home security. The technician was there and gone inside of 2 hours. The cameras were small, inconspicuous. I told no one. I watched the first 3 days of footage on my laptop at the office with the door locked. I don't have the words to describe what those 3 days looked like. On the afternoon of the second day, I watched my daughter-in-law open my wife's medication binder. She removed 2 of the pill organizers, went to her purse, and took out a small amber vial. She opened it. She added something to several of the compartments. Then she replaced the organizers in the binder, closed it, put the vial back in her purse, and called my wife for her afternoon medication. I watched my wife take the pills. I watched my daughter-in-law hand her a glass of water and smile. I sat very still for a while. Then I stood up and called my business partner and told him I needed him to come to my office right now. And something in my voice must have told him this wasn't a scheduling matter, because he was there in 11 minutes. I showed him the footage. He watched it twice, without speaking. Then he said, "You haven't told your son." I said no. He said, "You need to call law enforcement before you call anyone else. Anyone else and she finds out, and the vial disappears." He was right. I knew he was right. But I want to tell you what that felt like. To know that calling the police on your daughter-in-law means the next call you make is to your son, that there is a before and an after, and once you make that call, every family photograph from the last 7 years looks different. Every Christmas table, every birthday dinner, every hug in the driveway, all of it retroactively lit by this. I made the call. I told them what I had. They told me to stay at the office, not to return home, not to alert anyone in the house. They asked me to send the footage. I sent it. They said they would contact me within the hour. It was the longest hour of my life, and I've had some long hours. They moved quickly once they had the footage. The vial was recovered. It contained a compound the toxicologist later identified as something that, administered in small doses over an extended period, would cause neurological symptoms consistent with, and increasingly misdiagnosed as, a progressive nerve disorder. My wife did not have the condition she had been diagnosed with. She had been slowly, methodically poisoned for the better part of a year. I want to stop here and tell you something, because I know what you're thinking. The same thing I thought in that first terrible hour after the call. Why? Why would anyone do this to a woman who loved her, who welcomed her, who cried in relief when she arrived? And the answer, when it came out in the investigation, was so ordinary and so ugly that it made me sick to my stomach. My son was the primary beneficiary of a life insurance policy. My daughter-in-law had significant debt my son didn't know about. She had done the math. She had decided that a slow decline was cleaner than anything else. She had read enough online to know how to make a disease look like a disease. She was not careless. She was not impulsive. She had been planning this. My wife spent 11 days in the hospital. There was a period in the second week when the doctors were cautious about what they told me, and I spent 3 nights in the chair beside her bed, watching monitors and talking to her about the hardware store and the sandpaper and all the things we still had left to do. She improved, slowly, then steadily. The neurologist told me that if it had continued another 2 months, the damage would likely have been permanent. My son flew in the day after the arrest. I've never seen a man look the way he looked when he walked off that plane, like something structural inside him had collapsed. We sat in the hospital parking lot for an hour before we went inside, and I put my arm around him and he leaned into me like he was 12 years old, and I just let him. I don't know what I expected. Rage, maybe. But what I felt was something older and quieter. Grief for what she had done to him. Grief for what my wife had endured without even knowing it was being done. And underneath both of those, something else. Something I'm still not sure what to call, an accounting of all the mornings I had driven to the office while someone in my house was doing what I just watched on a laptop screen, of all the evenings I'd looked at the medication binder and thought, color-coded tabs, how organized, how thoughtful. She was convicted 14 months later. The evidence was thorough. The vial, the footage, testimony from the toxicologist, records recovered from her phone showing research conducted over a period of months before she even volunteered to come stay with us. She had been planning it before she arrived, before she stood in my driveway with her 2 suitcases and her casserole dish, and let me hug her and tell her I was grateful. My wife sat in the courtroom on the last day of the trial. She'd asked to be there for the verdict. She wore the blue dress she'd worn to our son's college graduation, and she held my hand from the moment we sat down until the moment the verdict was read. Afterward, she didn't say anything. We drove home in silence, and when we pulled into the driveway, she turned and looked at the house for a moment before getting out. I asked her what she was thinking. She said she was thinking about the sandpaper. I asked her what she meant. She said, "You spent 31 years learning how to tell when someone's lying to you. I married you knowing that. I always felt safe because of it." She said she knew that what happened had shaken that, for me, maybe more than anything else, that someone had fooled me inside my own home for that long. She said she wanted me to know that she didn't see it as a failure. She said she thought the fact that it didn't occur to me that someone I welcomed could be doing what she was doing. That wasn't blindness. That was just the way good people are built. I'm not sure she's right about that. I've thought about it a lot, but I'm 63 years old, and the woman who laughed at a man holding sandpaper he'd never use is sitting in the garden right now in the late afternoon light, and the doctors say she's recovering better than they expected, and I think that means something. I think it means the accounting isn't finished yet. There are still things on the right side of the ledger that the other column hasn't taken. I check the cameras every morning. I don't know when I'll stop doing that. Maybe never. But she's out there in the garden, and I can see her from where I'm sitting, and right now, that's enough.